We've all heard of the Spanish Armada of 1588. But what about the English Armada of 1589? You've never heard of it. Maybe that's because this huge naval expedition was such an embarrassing and financially crippling failure that even today it's conveniently hidden in English history books. A golden age it was not. The undeclared Anglo-Spanish War, from 1585 to 1604, was a complex series of costly campaigns fought between Protestant England under Queen Elizabeth I and the Catholic Kingdom of Spain ruled by her former brother-in-law, King Philip II. It connected to several major European wars at the time and began with English troops aiding the Dutch rebels against Spain, also English pirates raiding Spanish treasure ships and naval battles in the Channel, the Spanish Main, the Caribbean, and Ireland. Despite the tons of gold bullion his conquistador armies had stolen from the Americas, Philip was practically bankrupt, due to his extravagant personal spending and the draining wars with France and Netherlands, which were all staggeringly expensive. He was only able to raise armies and fleets by keeping his men's pay permanently in arrears, thus they could not afford to desert. In the summer of 1587, the English Navy had enjoyed a victorious 3-month campaign against the Spanish under Sir Francis Drake, especially at Cadiz using fireships. Drake had already embarrassed Philip with his privateering exploits in the West Indies, taking towns and ships at will from the preeminent naval power of the time, but with this expedition, he had taken that insult to Philip's doorstep. Drake compounded the insult by publicly boasting that he had singed the King of Spain's beard. It further infuriated and humiliated Philip, already incensed by the execution of fellow Catholic Mary Queen of Scots earlier that year. The next year the English Navy, with the help of fierce storms, famously repelled the punitive Spanish Armada. But, in regard to the ample missing chunk of Elizabethan history from 1588 until 1603, it's as if the whole world simply vanished into the abyss. BBC period dramas, novels, and Hollywood movies rarely ever focus on this period, and suddenly jump from the Armada to the elderly Queen's somber court. The truth is that England continued to fight Spain, but suffered a string of humiliating and expensive military disasters. The English Armada of 1589, also known as the Armada or the Drake-Norris Expedition, was an ambitious revenge fleet sent against Spain in April by Queen Elizabeth in retaliation for their own Armada attack of the year before. This war fleet was much larger, and was led by Sir Francis Drake as Admiral and Sir John Norris as General, with 3 tasks: to destroy the battered Spanish Armada, which was being repaired in Santander and San Sebastian in northern Spain; to land at Lisbon in Portugal and raise a revolt to overthrow King Philip; to take the Azores and establish a permanent naval base with which to capture the incoming Spanish treasure fleets. Concerns over logistics and adverse weather delayed the departure of the fleet, composed of over 80 assorted ships. In addition to 10,000 troops, there were 4,000 sailors. But several issues dogged the campaign before it even began. The Dutch failed to supply their promised 60 warships. 1/3 of the food and drink rations had already been consumed, and the sheer number of volunteers had doubled the planned contingent of troops to 20,000 plus. The fleet also lacked siege guns and cavalry, which would severely compromise its military effectiveness. Since Elizabeth's coffers were empty, Drake and Norris floated the expedition as a joint stock company, with capital totaling £80,000. Over £25.2 million today, according to the Bank of England's financial calculator. So, Drake was eager to please the investors and, rather than adhere to the Queen's strict orders, He bypassed Santander in favor of what he did best: seek plunder and booty. He made a surprise landing at Corunna on the 4th of May and attacked the citadel, but it was repulsed with 1,500 dead, and some English ships were captured by a Spanish fleet. After 2 weeks of bitter fighting, the English limped away to attack Lisbon, but, owing to bad organization, severe sickness and starvation, the invaders failed again. The expected uprising by the loyal Portuguese never materialized, and, with local and Spanish reinforcements arriving, the English were forced to retreat and sail back north, tossing hundreds of their diseased dead overboard along the way. Drake then attempted to sail towards the Azores, but couldn't tack against the prevailing wind. With the rapidly rising numbers of dead, he abandoned the venture and, with even the disorganized fleet's decks loaded with the sick and dying, limped back to different ports from July the 10th, with enemy flotillas harassing his miserable fleet nearly the entire way. Some ships, lacking healthy crews to man their defenses, made easy targets. The survivors were even dying in the ports, and disease spread. Lord Burleigh issued a proclamation that access to London by expedition participants was prohibited on penalty of death. Norris had initially even declared the campaign a great success, and Elizabeth was overjoyed. But an anonymous source issued a detailed, scornful letter revealing the true, horrific scale of the disaster. None of the English objectives were achieved, and the opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the weakened Spanish navy was lost. As many as half of the English ships were sunk, scuttled, or captured. This joint stock expedition was an absolute financial and military failure. The Crown's severe financial problems were ultimately settled by simply not paying the survivors, just as Elizabeth and her treasurer, William Cecil, had done to the heroic English victors only the year before, who had also languished aboard their ships, forbidden to disembark, unpaid and dying in their thousands. According to English Tudor historian Professor R. B. Wernham, of the 3,722 men who returned home and demanded their pay, only 1,042 received any. Of the thousands of grieving widows who demanded their dead husbands' pay, only 119 received it. Thousands of English soldiers and sailors died, deserted, were captured, or missing. Various contemporary chroniclers reported that the death toll was over 18,000. Following a thorough investigation of the expedition, Drake and Norris were never publicly admonished. The Spanish victory marked a revival of Philip's naval power. The English failure infuriated Elizabeth and further depleted the already woeful financial resources of England's treasury. In August 1595, after emerging from 6 years of disgrace following this, Elizabeth sent the Drake-Hawkins Expedition of 27 ships and 2,500 men against the Spanish strongholds of Puerto Rico and Panama, in an attempt to strike a blow against the source of Spain's gold and silver. Drake embarked on a long and disastrous campaign in the Spanish Americas, suffering several consecutive defeats there. Ravaged with dysentery and other diseases, the English were defeated. Hawkins died of fever and Drake died soon after from dysentery, was buried at sea, and the woeful expedition was forced to retreat back to England, all the while harassed by the Spanish West Indian fleet. This second defeat humiliatingly ended English hopes of establishing a presence in the Caribbean Sea. Philip now launched a second Spanish Armada, this time to Ireland in October 1596. A war fleet of 140 various ships, and 20,000 men were sent to assist Irish rebels in their revolt against the English crown, and to open a new front in the war, forcing English troops away from France and the Netherlands, the main arena of Spanish fighting. It was late in the campaigning season and the seas were rough, but Philip launched his new Grand Armada anyway. But before it had even left Spanish waters, storms yet again shattered his fleet, causing severe damage and forcing the fleet to return to their home ports. As the magnitude of the disaster became more fully known, Philip reluctantly cancelled the enterprise in mid-November. Nearly 5,000 men died either from drowning or disease, and 38 ships were lost, including 2 vast ships carrying full pay chests of gold. The grievous material and financial losses only added to the bankruptcy of the Spanish kingdom. News of the scale of the disaster shocked allied countries as well as enemies, and the Spanish authorities feared a revenge English attack, like that of 1589. In June 1597, the Essex-Raleigh Expedition, or the Islands Voyage, was a campaign of 150 ships, 6,000 soldiers and 14,000 sailors led by the unstable Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex as admiral, the son-in-law of Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. With him were the Earl of Suffolk and Walter Raleigh as subordinates. It set off to the Azores to first destroy the Third Spanish Armada, and then capture their treasure fleet coming from America as it passed through the islands. However, the campaign was, yet again, a dismal failure. Essex defied the Queen's orders, pursuing the Spanish treasure without first defeating the Spanish battle fleet. Panic in England ensued, partly because, being so far away, the English fleet had been unable to prevent the Spanish fleet approaching the virtually undefended English coastline. However, as the Armada approached the Channel, it yet again was dispersed by the same storm which had battered the homebound English. Even so, some ships did push on and even landed troops sporadically on the English and Welsh coasts before Padilla finally ordered a retreat back to Spain. The Anglo-Dutch fleet limped back to an undefended England with great losses and a war of recriminations between Essex, in deep disgrace, and Raleigh. Essex's failed campaign to capture the Azores treasure fleet and now to intercept the Armada as it neared England, contributed to his decline in the Queen's favour, and he would be executed for rebellious treason in 1601. Lord Howard of Effingham immediately sent the English warships out to hunt for the Spanish fleet, capturing a number of their ships, but most of whom had already escaped back home. The expedition was the last major naval campaign of Elizabethan England. In October 1601, a Spanish fleet was again now sent to Ireland. After Philip's death in 1598, his son Philip III continued to support the Irish rebels. At Kinsale, 4,000 Spanish troops disembarked and, though the Spanish army took the town of Kinsale, they failed to secure the surrounding region and were thus besieged by an English army, under Lord Mountjoy. The Spanish, who had lost many men in the 3-month siege, surrendered the town to Mountjoy on terms and were allowed to sail home, only if they gave up their other garrisons, not knowing that another Spanish force with 6,000 men was within a few days of arriving. This other fleet never landed and promptly turned for home. The welcome victory of the English at the pivotal Battle of Kinsale was devastating to the existing Irish way of life, as the old Gaelic system of regional chieftains was finally broken and the power vacuum was filled by the English. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603 and the 19-year-long war became deadlocked. All military operations were brought to an end with the 1604 Treaty of London, negotiated between Philip III of Spain and new King of England, Protestant King James I. England and Spain restored the peace, agreed to cease their military interventions in the Netherlands and Ireland respectively, and resumed trade, which both countries badly needed. The English ended their high seas privateering and the Spanish finally recognized the Anglican monarchy. James, more lenient towards Catholics than Elizabeth, was walking a religious and political tightrope. The English public were deeply angry about the treaty, viewing it as a humiliating peace, as the king had deserted their Protestant Dutch allies in order to appease their Spanish enemy. It made James monumentally unpopular, though he still allowed the Dutch army to recruit English volunteer soldiers in their service, and English corsairs sought service with the Dutch, who again preyed on Spanish shipping. Conversely, Spanish warships and privateers were allowed to use English ports as naval bases to attack Dutch shipping, or to transport reinforcements to Flanders. Yes, Spanish warships using English ports after failing to invade them. It would be another 50 years before England's fleet could ever challenge the Spanish again. Regarding the English Armada, the chair of the British Historical Association Secondary Education Committee, Ben Walsh, stated about the concealment of this passage of English history. It is completely overlooked. It is never mentioned in the history courses taught in British schools, and a majority of British history teachers have never even heard of it. It may seem unfair that a disastrous attack by England against Spain has been completely forgotten. While a disastrous attack by Spain against England is universally remembered.